Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the surveillance scandal that has broken out in India and as well as around the world. Recently, a global collaborative investigation known as Pegasus Project or Project Pegasus has allegedly revealed that governments around the world used a highly sophisticated spyware to carry out targeted and highly intrusive surveillance, thus violating the right to privacy and right to liberty of thousands of individuals around the world. This joint global investigation has been carried out by few leading media outlets of the world, such as Washington Post, Guardian, and The Wire from India, along with global human rights and civil rights organizations such as Amnesty International. Through this investigation, it has been alleged that several governments around the world, including the Indian government, reportedly made use of a highly sophisticated software known as Pegasus to carry out highly intrusive surveillance against a list of targets. Pegasus is essentially a sophisticated spyware that has been developed by a technology and cybersecurity firm of Israel known as the NSO Group. This company, headed by former Israeli intelligence officials, has developed Pegasus, and reportedly it has become the most preferred surveillance tool by governments around the world. The Pegasus spyware has been designed to target and infect smartphones and turn these devices itself into tools of surveillance. Reportedly, this spyware has the potential to breach and infiltrate smartphones that run on both iOS and Android operating systems, and it is designed to provide complete remote access to the attacker, thereby enabling them to turn the smartphone itself, which is the targeted device for surveillance, into a tool for surveillance. The reason why governments around the world are being accused of making use of the surveillance tool is because, as informed by the NSO Group, the company doesn't sell this software to private entities and private individuals. This highly sophisticated surveillance tool is sold only to vetted governments which are approved by the Israeli government, and its end user has to be a law enforcement agency or an intelligence agency of this country. So, based on a careful digital forensic study of devices that were reportedly infected, the lead organizations involved in Pegasus project have claimed that several governments around the world, including the Indian government, has reportedly procured this controversial spyware from Israel and used it to carry out targeted surveillance against those who are critical of the government and those who dissent and oppose the government by using the pretext of national security. But in the context of India, the government of India has dismissed these allegations, and it has stated that India is a vibrant democracy where right to free speech and liberty is respected, and there are sufficient lawful mechanisms through which surveillance can be carried out. And whenever such surveillance is mounted by the state in order to protect national security, it is done by abiding to the due process of law. So, in the context of this emerging controversy, first let's understand what was the Pegasus spyware, how was it used to mount targeted surveillance, and what are the constitutional and legal implications of this. See, this is not the first time that Pegasus spyware is in news. Just a few years back, in 2019, even then it was widely reported that Pegasus spyware was widely misused by governments around the world, including the Indian government, to target those who were opposed to the government and to target those who were critical of the government by using national security grounds. The earlier version of Pegasus was designed to carry out social engineering techniques in order to install the spyware on the targeted smartphone. Social engineering is nothing but the usage of variety of techniques to deceive the target or the usage of a bait to entice the target to initiate some action which would end up downloading the spyware onto the targeted device. For example, the target could be sent certain messages or emails which raises the interest and the curiosity of the target, thus inviting the targeted user to initiate a basic action on his phone, either by clicking the link or by opening the message or by downloading an attachment, which ends up installing the spyware on the smartphone. So initial versions of this spyware were using social engineering techniques to gain access to the smartphone, where the user or the target was being tricked to initiate some form of action on the phone, which would end up downloading the spyware, thereby leading to the infiltration of the device. But now, through the latest round of investigation, it has been revealed that Pegasus has undergone a major upgrade and it has become even more sophisticated because right now it is capable of engineering zero click attacks, meaning it doesn't require any social engineering and it doesn't need any intervention by the target. Even without the target initiating any action and with absolutely no user interaction, the spyware can be installed on a targeted smartphone, thereby turning it into a surveillance tool. So, spywares which can engineer such attacks are referred to as zero click attacks, where there is no involvement of the user and there is no action being taken by the user. In both the cases, the user would be completely unaware of the malicious nature of the software which is getting installed in the background. And without the knowledge of the target, the spyware, once downloaded and installed, will hand over complete remote access to the attacker. The targeted user would be completely unaware that he has become a victim of a spyware, but meanwhile, the attacker would have gained complete remote access over the target's device, thereby enabling them to monitor all the data on the phone and even control and manipulate the data, including the ability to control the functions and the operations of the phone. So, this will allow the attacker to read the messages, to manipulate the call logs, to operate the camera and the microphones, to download any document and install any evidence, and even access the location data of the target by tracking the GPS signals. So, this becomes a tool not just for surveillance and not just for espionage. It could also become a tool for manipulation by planting evidence that is false evidence on these devices, based on which the targets could be harassed. This is why the widespread usage of Pegasus spyware is so controversial. And in the Indian context, if it has been used by the Indian government, as it has been alleged, it represents unlawful interception, which is a direct breach of several constitutional and legal safeguards. But however, the government of India has denied these allegations, and the controversy continues to rage in India and as well as abroad. But without getting into the politics behind this, let's understand this topic from an examination perspective. Here, the topic for discussion is state surveillance, that is, state sponsored surveillance, and how it creates a conflict between the need to protect the country's national security and its potential to violate fundamental rights such as right to free speech, right to liberty, and right to privacy, which have been guaranteed under Article 19 and Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. It gives us an opportunity to talk about the constitutional and legal safeguards that exist in India to protect the fundamental rights of citizens from state-sponsored surveillance, and it allows us to evaluate whether these safeguards are enough and what measures could be taken to protect the privacy and data security of citizens. The writers of this column argue that surveillance reform is the need of the hour in India because, according to them, state-led surveillance on the grounds of national security has repeatedly led to the breach of basic fundamental rights as a result of the complete absence of effective checks and balances in the system. See, states have a need to carry out surveillance, especially targeted surveillance, in order to protect and promote the country's national security. This is an essential part of intelligence gathering, and it happens to be one of the legitimate exercises in order to garner actionable intelligence, which could help in pointing out specific threats to the state's security, which could be posed by terrorists, hostile countries, hostile intelligence agencies, etc. But this need for state surveillance has to be balanced with fundamental rights and legal rights. Because if state surveillance is unchecked, if there are no checks and balances, it will most definitely result in its misuse because the ruling parties will often tend to misuse the government machinery and the intelligence apparatus to target their political opponents and dissenters. But in a democracy, political opposition, dissent, criticism of the government is a basic fundamental right, and any attempt by the government to stifle these rights is grossly unconstitutional. Now, in the case of the Pegasus controversy, the investigation has revealed that hundreds of individuals in India were on the target list, and they all included journalists, who have been critical of the central government. It also included leaders of the opposition, and along with them, even scientists, social activists, human rights activists, and shockingly, even judges, diplomats, businessmen, and government officials, and even government ministers have been targeted. If these allegations are true, it represents a very serious case of breach of right to free speech, right to liberty, and right to privacy. And this is what has triggered the current political controversy in the country. But however, the government has defended itself against these allegations by stating that if there is any interception carried out by state agencies, it always follows the due process of law, and the government has refused to acknowledge whether it deployed the Pegasus spyware, as it has been revealed through this investigation. Now, the writers of this column, they express complete shock and surprise that the government had to resort to an illegal interception method by using the controversial Pegasus spyware, because as claimed by the government, there are several lawful interception methods which are enabled by the law itself, and this includes Section 5 of the Indian Telegraph Act and Section 69 of the Information Technology Act. The Indian Telegraph Act allows for lawful interception of telephones, which can be carried out as per an established process, whereas Section 69 of the IT Act enables state interception of any communication that is undertaken by using a computer resource. The writers argue that if these allegations are true, then there was no need for the government to rely upon an illegal software to carry out such widespread interception, because unfortunately, our laws have created a covert opaque mechanism which enables the government to carry out the same interception while allowing the government to claim that it is following the due process of law. The writers are critical of these legal provisions under the Indian Telegraph Act and the IT Act because these provisions enable legal surveillance that is completely covert and opaque without any checks and balances. See, currently, as per the lawful surveillance that is allowed, interception orders are approved by the Union Home Secretary at the national level and the State Home Secretary at the state level. The list of individuals who are being targeted for surveillance is frequently approved by the Home Secretaries, and the government claims this to be a system of checks and balances in order to prevent the misuse of legal interception by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. But here, the writers raise a very important point that in the case of surveillance and interception, checks and balances and accountability cannot be ensured by the executive itself. Because this would be a case where there would be no separation of powers. Because the agencies carrying out the interception, even though legally, would be the law enforcement and intelligence agencies which are a part of the government, which are a part of the executive. And the one who is supposed to review this process and ensure accountability of these agencies to prevent the misuse is the Home Secretary, who again happens to be a part of the government and the executive. So based on this internal process of checks and balances, the government often claims that it follows due process of law with regard to lawful interception. But however, activists have always pointed out that this internal process of review is completely covert and opaque, and no one outside the government knows what is happening. And there are no independent checks and balances to ensure accountability of the intelligence agencies. Then moreover in India, intelligence agencies like IB, RAW and the others, they are not accountable to the parliament. There is no parliamentary oversight or judicial oversight over India's intelligence agencies, and they are solely accountable to the executive. In such a scenario, internal checks and balances cannot be trusted, cannot be effective, and unfortunately the aggrieved party, that is the ones who are being targeted for surveillance, they will not even be aware that they are being observed and monitored by the government, thus denying them any legal remedies. This covert opaque mechanism enabled by these two laws violates Article 32 and Article 226 of those who are being targeted for surveillance because it denies them an opportunity to approach the court for any legal remedy where they can seek the courts to exercise their writ jurisdiction to protect their fundamental rights. Such covert opaque surveillance by the state also violates the individual's right to privacy, which has been clearly recognized as a fundamental right under Article 21, that is under right to life, following the landmark judgment of the Supreme Court in the K.S. Puttaswamy case. Plus, the government, doesn't share such information through the RTI by citing the grounds of national security, thereby creating a completely opaque and covert process of surveillance. So clearly, there is a need for independent oversight from a body which is not part of the executive or the government, and hence the writer suggests judicial oversight in order to establish an effective system of checks and balances and accountability with regard to targeted surveillance for national security. The writers say that such judicial oversight becomes all the more important because the latest Pegasus investigation has revealed that even a judge of the Supreme Court was targeted for surveillance by using the Pegasus spyware. So this raises very serious questions about judicial independence as well, because the widespread usage of such an intrusive spyware can end up having a chilling effect on free speech. Because once an individual or a group of people are aware that they are being targeted by the government through surveillance, it will have a chilling effect on their ability to carry out free speech and as well as on their right to liberty and right to privacy. Now, for example, if a class of journalists who are being critical of the government in their reporting, if they are known to be targeted for state surveillance, then all the journalists will start fearing state surveillance, and this will have a chilling effect on the right to free press and free speech. It's also very important to note that the personal data protection law that the government has tabled in the parliament doesn't consider state surveillance under its ambit, and in fact, it provides for very wide exemptions for government security and intelligence agencies, thereby further weakening the legal mechanism in the country to prevent the abuse of state-sponsored surveillance. While legitimate surveillance is essential to protect the country's national security and to defend the country against threats such as terrorism and espionage sponsored by foreign countries, such state-sponsored surveillance cannot become a tool to violate the fundamental rights of the citizens by engaging in targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. Now let's take up a column from page number 7. As the Tokyo Olympics is all set to begin, the writer of this column tries to chart a course to make India a sporting nation. As you might be aware, India's Olympic performance is usually not very impressive because following India's best ever performance in the 2012 London Olympics, India's performance declined considerably at the Rio Olympics of 2016. Over the last 30 to 40 years, especially from 1970 onwards, India's Olympic performance has been below average as compared to the stellar performances of several other large and small countries. So with regard to sporting performance and a country's ability to nurture the sporting culture, several studies have been carried out, and one such study, which was published in 2004, tried to create a link between the country's GDP and its Olympic performance. This study was based on the fact that sporting performance of a particular country can be influenced by several factors. The ability of a country to produce world-class athletes and to dominate certain sporting events is determined by several factors, which includes health, nutrition, genetic factors, and the kind of sporting infrastructure and the training environment that is available. Obviously, in a country with very poor health standards, you can't expect to produce leading athletes and sports persons of the world. In countries where nutrition standards are below average, and in countries where stunting, malnutrition, and anemia is quite common, world-class athletes cannot be produced, and naturally the performance of these countries will be subdued. Then, of course, there could also be few genetic factors which could influence the performance of a country. For example, with regard to swimming, US, Australia, they are considered as powerhouses. These countries completely dominate swimming, whereas China and other Asian countries fall behind. That's perhaps because taller people and broader people have an advantage in sports like swimming, whereas height may not play a key role in shooting or gymnastics. Then China, for that matter, completely dominates shooting, along with other countries like US and Germany, and this is mainly because of the excellent sporting infrastructure that they provide to their athletes. Then, for example, if you look at table tennis, East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries often dominate the sport, whereas Russia, East European countries and Central Asian countries, they do very well with regard to boxing, wrestling and weightlifting. So while countries like US, Australia and China, while they deliver stellar performances, there are many other smaller countries as well, which are able to perform well at least in one or two sports where they completely dominate the sporting field. But unfortunately, the same cannot be said about India. While India's relative performance over the last couple of decades has improved slightly, India is still not the best in any sport, and India barely manages to win a couple of medals in each edition of the Olympics. So the writer correctly points out that there are several factors which can influence the sporting performance of a nation, and this includes health, nutrition, genetic factors, and more importantly, the ability of the government to mobilize resources to create state of the art sporting infrastructure and world class training facilities, which is usually the case with developed nations and large countries. See, a few decades ago, that is between 1930s and 1970s, India was actually faring pretty well, especially amongst the third world and developing underworld countries, because India did get some international sporting exposure due to colonial rule. Compared to other Asian and African colonies, India did have an edge because of its early exposure, and hence India was winning medals in a few sports, especially in sports such as hockey. But post decolonization, as many of the former colonies started dominating few sports, India fell behind even in the category of developing underdeveloped nations. And this was largely a result of its limited resources and poor training facilities and infrastructure. Hence, the writer argues that the time has come for India to start focusing on few specific sports where the physical build and the genetic factors do not matter. And in such sports where the physical build is not a disadvantage, India will have to give additional thrust by creating the right kind of infrastructure and training facilities so that even India can start dominating at least a few sporting domains. But to scale up our overall performance in the long run, India will have to come out with a comprehensive national sports policy that will give specific focus to states. He suggests that under such a policy, India should not only create the best possible sporting infrastructure and training facilities, but it should also collaborate with state governments and the private sector to create a one state, one sport model. Based on the physical build of Indians in different states and based on their respective food habits, a different sport could be encouraged in each state, which could possibly help India improve its performance drastically. For example, in Haryana, India has produced the best of boxers and wrestlers, and the physical build of the people in this region and their food habits has a lot to do with this performance. Along with this, the right kind of sporting infrastructure and training facilities are available in Haryana, which has allowed the state to dominate certain sporting domains. So the writer suggests if something similar could be replicated on a national level by adopting a one state, one sport policy, and parallelly, if the healthcare and nutritional needs are met, along with the creation of world class training and sporting infrastructure, then definitely in the long run, India's Olympic performance will also improve. And it could help India cultivate a sporting culture and make the country a sporting nation. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial and a related article on page number 1 that deals with the topic of right to religion and right to life. That is the debate between Article 25 and Article 21, which has come under question in the light of pandemic restrictions on religious activities. We recently covered this topic on the 17th of July, and we had discussed in detail the observations of the Supreme Court, where it had taken a stand against the Kumbh Mela and the Kanwar Yatra, and how it ordered a complete stoppage of all these religious activities in order to contain the spread of the pandemic. The Supreme Court argued that right to religion comes with reasonable restrictions, which includes health, that is the health of the citizens, which is an integral part of right to life under Article 21. Hence, the Supreme Court had said that right to health is a superior fundamental right as compared to right to religion, and on these grounds, all religious activities will have to be curbed in order to contain the further spread of the pandemic. So the editorial further evaluates this decision, but despite this ruling of the Supreme Court, in a controversial move, the government of Kerala has provided for relaxations with regard to COVID restrictions for the celebration of Bakrid. Following this, the Supreme Court has taken the Kerala government to task, and it has reminded the state government of its recent ruling with regard to banning the Kanwar Yatra, and it has stated that right to health clearly supersedes right to faith, that is faith of all religions. And considering the pandemic, These orders cannot be violated by the state governments and the center at any cost. So for further understanding, please go back and watch this video from the 17th of July and go through this editorial once. Then according to this article on page number 10, the Bombay High Court has ruled that speedy trial is a fundamental right because in the absence of a speedy trial, the accused will languish in jail for years together, which ends up depriving their fundamental rights. Hence, the Bombay High Court has called upon the governments, the law enforcement agencies, the police, and the judiciary to speed up trials because any unnecessary delay in the trial is a violation of the fundamental right of the accused. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine the constitutional and legal safeguards in India with regard to state led surveillance. Do they suffice? The second question: illustrate the steps to be taken to make India a sporting nation. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So, this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.